Good evening.
Parole aux femmes, briser le silence.
We're opening the floor to women. We're breaking the silence. Let us welcome Atiya Khan.
Congratulations, Atiya.
Thank you.
Shall we sit down?
Sure. Thanks.
It's okay. La soirée se passera en anglais et en français.
We'll be talking English and French tonight. You can have headsets to hear the translation. Atiya understands a bit of French, and you will also be able to ask her questions later on. Atiya has been arriving from Sweden, where the film has been shown. She's touring Europe.
Does this process of seeing this movie help healing every time, or is it difficult for you to go back to it?
It's difficult. The process of making the film was very therapeutic, and but what I didn't think about when I was making the film, because I just wanted to get it done, is I never thought about what it would mean to actually show it to an audience full of people. And it's been a lot harder than I thought. I've been traveling with the film for about almost 10 months now. And every, I sort of, in the film, for me, I get a sense of closure and healing that happens. But when I watch the film over and over and talk about it over and over, which obviously I am excited to do because this is my passion, but it's been very difficult, and it's been a roller coaster, and I've gone through a pretty deep depression recently.
After the movie?
After the movie. During the movie I was okay, and it's been in the last few months that it's been quite difficult for me.
But words do heal?
They do.
They do?
They do. They can.
We'll try to pronounce them and also greet the words that some people may want to offer you this evening. But I'd like to introduce our other guests. Nos autres invités ce soir sont Colline de Sénarclan.
Our other guests tonight are Colline de Sénarclan. Can you come up on the stage, Colline?
Colline, militante féministe,
she's a feminist, activist and journalist. She's working for the RTS radio and television.
Passer mon micro, c'est bon. Voilà, j'aimerais également inviter Maha El Arazi.
I would also like to invite Maha El Arazi.
Maha est directrice exécutive de IMCAN,
executive director for IMCAN, an organization against violence committed against women, minority women.
Arazi, just sit down. Et enfin, Caroline Dehaas, féministe française.
And Caroline Dehaas, who is also a French feminist. They all came this afternoon to be with us tonight.
Mariah, a couple of words of just the movie, seeing it again. It's the second time you see it.
Yeah,
and hold your mic, yeah.
So, just to acknowledge you, Atiya, I think there's something about women being able to choose their own pathways of healing. And you chose one that you shared with us. And it's so powerful and so amazing. So thank you, first of all. Thank you as a survivor, and thank you as a filmmaker, because that's your work as well, right? And also, as I said to you earlier, the film is important in so many ways. One, because it's your story, but two, because we don't see narratives around women of color experiencing violence from white men. And some of us happen to be in relationships with white people, right? And all the narratives around the violence that we experience really focus on our communities and on the violent men in our communities. And so what you've done is you've given voice to a whole space where there is no kind of acknowledgement. And that's really important. So huge gratitude from us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marai. Colline?
C'est un film, je pense,
This film
qui dérange autant qu'il
is just as disturbing as it is moving. I feel moved and disturbed at the same time, because it's dealing with a very difficult subject, and I think you dealt with it with enormous talent, and giving the floor to authors of violence is very delicate, very sensitive. What I really like about the approach taken is that you talk about choice, responsibility.
Quand j'ai entendu parler du film, j'avais des
When I heard about the film, I was a bit anxious. I didn't know exactly whether we would have too much empathy for him. And in that film, that's exactly what you explain. You have compassion for him, but you don't at the same time. And I think that's one of the great things about the movie, because it's open. It's the first step. How can you give the floor to violent men so that they can fight violence, they can take their own responsibility in that approach, which is, to me, a very feminist approach.
To listen to everyone, and then I'll have you answer, okay? Caroline de Hassa.
Oui, alors d'abord un grand merci, parce que
well, first of all, I want to thank you very much. There are two very strong, very powerful things in this film, two especially. The first thing is that you can have been a victim and become such a cool person as you are today, and that's absolutely amazing. That's really crazy. For me, it's full of hope. It's a very hopeful message. This is not the end of the story. When you've been raped, when you've been abused, you've been hit, it's not the end of the road. You can have a life, you can, of course, you will have traces afterwards in your life, but you can have a life, your own life, and that's very strong and powerful for me. And I thought you were so incredible, really, as a woman. And the other very strong point for me is that you are showing the face of an attacker, a violent man, whereas quite often we don't have an image of them, we don't see them. In France, at the moment, we have a communication campaign to fight sexual harassment in public transport, and it shows a picture of a woman, and from behind her there's a shark or another type of wild beast. But in this film, you're showing that attackers are not monsters, they are human beings of everyday life. And when you start seeing understanding that one out of two women was the victim of some kind of abuse, it means that around us, all around us, there are potential attackers. And victims, potential victims, can be our sisters, our grandmothers, our mothers. So it means that among our fathers, grandfathers, uncles, there are attackers. And I think this is a first step that is indispensable if we want, as a society, to really fight violence. Thank you very much for that.
Merci, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
I mean, how come Steve accepted, to go through this movie, to go public? It was important for you, of course, but for him too. Was it good to give him that visibility?
I think. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think it was. And I asked Steve, it was probably around almost 5 years ago, we had bumped into each other on the streets in Toronto, where since I escaped from him, every few years I would run into him. And at first, for the first, maybe 10 years, I was terrified when I saw him. But that slowly, as my life got better, and I, went to university, and I had a stable partner, and I was living in a house that I really liked. Things were stable. Something shifted in me when I had seen him, and I realized that he didn't look like he was doing well. And I became curious about that. I was like, I was going to school for a feminist counseling program, and I just thought, I don't wish the way that Steve looked to me, he was so affected, and he looked like he was in so much pain that I actually don't wish that on anyone, even the person who hurt me. But I did become curious, and there was a moment where I was like, wow, I wonder if the pain that he put me through and the trauma, I wonder if that's affected him. I wonder if he lives with this every day of his life like I do. And it was about 2 decades, yeah, so it was 20 years had gone by, and I bumped into him on the street. I had this idea for a documentary, and I'd been working in the field, and I was angry, and I was disappointed. The calls kept coming, domestic violence, like it was not decreasing, and I was like, what is going on? Like, why can't we stop this? And because I had seen Steve not long before that thought, it made me think of him, and I thought, what is going on with him? What is going on with so many men who are choosing to use violence? And when I had that thought, I actually went online and I thought, well, is there even help available, right? Like, I know all the help that's available for me and for other survivors. Is there help that exists for people who use violence? So I looked it up, and immediately a few places in Canada popped up, a few organizations, a few programs, and I was shocked. And I actually felt angry because I thought, I've been educated in this field and I've been working in the field, and I never, ever knew what was going on with the people who are harming. And when I saw, so I felt angry, and then I felt hope for the first time. And I was like, oh, wow. You know, I read some of their mandates and the type of work that they were doing, and the big thing is that they work with people who use violence, and that it's possible that through therapy, people who use violence can learn how to be in really healthy, caring relationships. Doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen. And that gave me this incredible sense of hope, and I thought, I'd like to talk to Steve.
Why the title, A Better Man?
A Better Man? It's a title that not everyone loves, to be quite honest, but it actually came from Steve. So I had met with him after we had shot once, and we met about a month afterwards. We usually would check in and have a tea and just see how we were doing, because the conversations that we had were very intense. And so we met, and we were about to leave, and he said, you know, Tia, I'm so sorry, and I really wish I could have been a better man. And I remember hearing that. And what I like about it is it's not saying like a great man. It's not a good man. It's better. And it's something that I feel like we all need to be, all of us, not just Steve and not just people who use violence. What I liked is that, you know, we're all capable of harming each other, and we all, you know, if we're not abusive, we can still be very hurtful to the people that we care for, and we should all be striving to be better people. Yeah.
Thank you, Atay. J'aimerais qu'on vienne justement à cette position de
Let's come back on the position of the aggressor. Why not resort to justice? Who would like to answer?
Caroline.
Peut-être que pour que la... Enfin, là, c'est large comme question.
This is a very wide question you're putting. Well, I think Atia chose the healing process through talking, but it is not always possible to go back and talk to your aggressor. And on the other hand, you could also prefer to resort to justice, or would maybe want revenge. Well, first of all, justice is not about revenge. Justice is about society telling us that this is not allowed. So let's find some kind of way of repairing. But in France nowadays, not all judges are doing their work very well when it comes to violence against women. A few months back in France, a trial court decided that an 11-year-old girl who had been raped by a 20-year-old man was probably consentful. She was 11 years old. And a few years ago, a friend of mine was raped by a man in the street. She described the aggressor. There was a trial. but she described that he had a mark on the face, on the wrong side on the face, so he was acquitted. And this happens day in, day out, everywhere, I guess, and not only in France. So as long as justice doesn't do the job properly, I don't feel myself like telling other women to go and lodge a complaint. I don't know if it's the right solution. I myself lodged a complaint for violence I was subjected to online. It took me several months and it ended up in nothing, absolutely nothing. So as long as justice doesn't do the job properly, you can't ask women to be themselves responsible and go and do the work instead of the justice system. Yeah, I agree entirely. This is something that is often, we are accused of not encouraging women to go and lodge complaints because the justice system should be the ideal solution, but we know very well that it's not the case. And clearly in a film we talk about resilience. Resilience is possible when, after a trauma, you are in a long-term, in a good environment. Going through the justice system is, in fact, probably the worst experience you can go through. You're going to deal with the judges, with lawyers. Only recently, I was told about the young girl who had a complaint against an aggressor, and she had to face him alone. So it's such a stressful situation. Sending someone through this process is terrible.
I think there is something around the importance of criminal justice processes, but criminal justice processes are not designed around us. Criminal justice processes are by their very nature adversarial. They're not necessarily the things that women choose. And for me, the thing that's always going to be the priority is what makes her feel safe. What's the thing that will have her feel supported? What's the thing that she's saying that she needs? We generally in society think that that's going to be a criminal justice pathway, but does it deliver justice? Whose justice is it delivering? Is it the justice that we think we're talking about when we think, okay, we're going to lock all these violent men up, and then we're going to have prisons that are full of all of these violent men, and then where they go and learn more misogynistic behavior, and you know, like, have we interrupted the violence? I'm interested in how do we make sure that she's safe, that she's well, that we're sending the messages out that violence is unacceptable, that we're preventing this, but also that we do something other than simply focus on a criminal justice system that is not designed to support survivors. I don't know of a criminal justice system that is working for survivors right now. I really don't. And I would like there to be such a system, but I haven't encountered that.
Therefore, the importance of shelters.
Absolutely, and rape crisis centers and, you know, telephone support lines, etc. We need structures that are built around survivors, victims, etc., rather than systems that are built completely focused on this adversarial structure with lawyers nuking it out with each other in court, right? And actually in the UK, you know, a survivor shows up as a witness. That's how our system is designed, right? So like, this thing has happened to me and I show up as a witness. That's crazy. It's not centered around me. It's actually centered around a system of kind of legal officials going into battle with each other. And so the entire system is flawed.
Ataya, you didn't go to a shelter.
I did not. I didn't know at that time that shelters existed. I had never heard of them. I was 16, and I wish, like, that's something that someone could have done for me in terms of intervention, like the teacher, just to have known that these services existed. It's possible that I could have left Steve earlier, and obviously I wouldn't have had to have so much abuse for such a long time. But in terms of justice, I agree. You know, for me, this film is justice, and I do believe that we need to try and be creative and figure out other paths to justice. The truth is that a lot of people who have been harmed don't want the person who harmed them to go to prison. That's not something they want, but they want the violence to stop. And what we don't do is we don't ask the people who have been harmed, what is it that you need to move forward? What do you need to restore safety? What do you need to feel a sense of healing? And those are the questions I believe that we need to start answering. And I think for me, with the justice system, like for me, I never, the police did get called twice. I didn't call the police, and it was at a time I was living in Ontario, a province in Canada, when the police came, and what they'd do is they'd ask me in front of Steve, and both times there was actually friends of mine who were there as well, who called the cops. And the two police officers said, you know, do you want to charge him? And so I'm standing there, my friends are there, they're all like, do it, you know? And Steve's looking at me, and there was no way that I was gonna charge him because he would get out and hurt me. And I knew that, and a lot of women are quite aware of the danger that they're in, and we make choices based on that other people sometimes think don't make sense. Like, how could you not want to charge him? Well, because I think that he might come out and he might kill me. That's really valid.
Mm-hmm. Being terrorized.
Sans oublier que la justice.
I mean, we shouldn't forget that, you know, justice is not so partial. I mean, you know, we're talking about, you know, white man who's abusing a colored woman, and there are issues, there are class issues, socioeconomic class issues, and this is one of the reasons why, for me, justice is not an appropriate tool. And you know, for me, you know, the judicial system is not a solution. Yes, I mean, of course, I mean, it has to actually come into play, and it's quite legitimate. I mean, we shouldn't discourage women who want to initiate proceedings against the aggressor, but there are many, many defects and defaults, and also being able to, you know, talk to others, and also shelters. What happens in France? So what the associations who are there for women victims, they explain the mechanisms in the aggressor's mind, and that make it possible to understand that, you know, we are not the problem. It's not our fault, but that, you know, we are involved in a mechanism that many, many, many women, millions of women endure. And there's a 5-step mechanism that we find in every type of abuse. So it's isolation, where you actually prevent friends from being around, and actually to devaluating a person, you know, little words where you actually lose your own self-esteem and self-confidence. The third thing is the inverting guilt. And, you know, okay, the slap went off too, you know, I slapped you too fast, but, you know, there was a reason. Okay, you flirted with one of my friends on Facebook, the coffee you made was too hot, and this sort of inversion of guilt. And the fourth is threat, fear, and the fifth item is to ensure impunity, to organize so that the people around the couple finds that person, the aggressor, a great guy. And so whatever is done says, oh, this is not the guy as we knew him. It's not possible. You know, I mean, there are, you know, many American actors who did, you know, great feminist discourse, you know, on stage, you know, with the white ribbons. And the next week, the 15 women said, they spoke up and they said that such and such an actor had actually harassed them. So devaluation, inverting guilt, threat, and fear, and to ensure impunity. So you find this in every story of abuse. So in your environment, you have a friend, a girlfriend, or a member of your family who's actually doesn't want to see friends and is devaluating herself, who finds she's no longer intelligent or pretty or whatever, and that you find the partner such a great guy. That should ring bells. There should be warning signals. And you are probably in the presence of someone who is actually being abused.
Right.
There is something around how do we, as communities and as society, hold violent men to account. And I think, I'm not familiar with the program that Steve went through in terms of that individual way of working. We have perpetrator programs in the UK that are run using a feminist model that basically come from a position of, you know, like a group of men in a room with each other and with a woman facilitator and a man facilitator, and looking at actually how you work with men over kind of 26 weeks to build this idea of accountability. And some of that, and the reason that feminist model is appropriate is because it focuses on that thing that the council was trying to draw out and that Atia spoke about earlier, which is about control. So it interrupts this idea that I lost control, or that I was angry, or I wasn't breastfed, or whatever the thing is that, you know, men sometimes use to kind of say, this is why I did it, and focuses on the idea of choice. Actually, you're choosing violent behavior. There is something about you needing to exercise power and control in this situation, and actually you're completely accountable for your behavior. And what you're doing is you're starting to take responsibility. This has nothing to do with whether the coffee was this, or, you know, so it then focuses on I, as an abuser, need to be responsible. And that's so critical, because we need to start to build accountability in terms of, you know, violent men.
That we're all accountable when we stay and remain silent, which is really quite shocking in your movie when you mentioned that the teachers had noticed, talked to Steve, but didn't talk to you, and that when you run out in the street, no one comes. How can, it's difficult to explain or to understand.
It's very difficult, yeah. I have a lot of anger still towards the teachers that didn't do anything. Although I'm not, in one way, I'm also not surprised, because so many people don't have the tools, right? They don't know how to actually intervene, what that looks like. It's very scary. There's also so many of us that have experienced violence who many of us have not been able to deal or cope. And so the thought of having to help somebody else is just, it's too much. But in terms of the neighbors, and sometimes there were friends, there were strangers that actually witnessed some of the physical abuse. And it was, what happens when you don't intervene, for me, it made me feel like I deserved it, because people would see it and not do anything. And it just reinforced this idea that I deserved it, and that this is what happens in relationships. And it also made me feel even more alone. And I think what's scary, you know, it is scary to intervene, especially if there's violence that's happening right in front of you. But you can intervene before an incident and after an incident. And a lot of people think that it has to be like this huge heroic act. And it doesn't. It's actually a whole bunch of small things that you do that over time gives confidence to someone who is experiencing violence to know that they don't deserve it. And so if you know somebody who is experiencing abuse, I urge you to just acknowledge it, to just say, you know what, I see that you're in pain, or I've noticed the bruises. I really care for you, and I'm here for you if you ever need anything. And I don't suggest telling somebody what you think they should do, because that doesn't work. So it's asking someone what is it that they need, and to really just reinforce the idea that no matter what, you're there for them, to help them, to love them, to care for them. You can also research local organizations for them, so that you can say, do you know that this exists in your, you know, in your community? That's huge. If they don't have money, you can offer to pay for things like legal help, or their rent, or therapy, or childcare while they go to access resources. And the same goes for people who use violence. People who use violence, who are committed to ending their violence, need love and support as well, and they need resources. If we really want to end violence against women, then we do need to help the people who are using violence. So that's something where you can step in as well, and to offer care and support and tell them, listen, I care for you, but I know that you're hurting your partner, or I know you're hurting your sister. I want to help, and I want to keep you committed to not using violence. And so, because they do need somebody to check in on them to make sure that it's going ahead. And so those are some things that we all can do to intervene, which would have made a huge difference in my life if I had a few people tell me I didn't deserve it. And it took about a year of people telling me that before I actually believed it, which was what helped me to leave in the end.
Il y a une chose qui est importantes, je pense, à dire
There's something important
autour de ce film en
that needs to be
particulier.
said about this film.
Ce que ce film a de bien, c'est qu'il
So
montre une
what's
histoire
good in this
particulière,
film,
une
it
histoire
shows us,
individuelle,
an individual
qui permet
story
d'avoir de l'empathie pour les
where we can
personnages,
feel
qui nous
empathy for the
qui
different
est
characters,
Steve, pourquoi il a fait
and
ça,
we ask,
etc.
who is
Des
Steve?
questions
Why
qui
did he
sont
do
très
this? Why did he act this way? These are very
individuelles,
individual
alors que,
questions,
comme vous
whereas,
l'avez dit,
as you said so well,
collective.
this is
Et,
collective
ce qui fait
abuse.
ça, c'est votre
And why I'm
remarque
saying
par
this is the
rapport
comment you made
professeur qui
as
n'était pas
regards,
outillé
the
pour
lecturer
vous aider.
who didn't have the tools
On a
to
une
help you.
société
So we are living in
qui
a
a un
society
souci, une
that
maladie
has a
sociale,
concern. This is a social
les hommes qui battent,
disease,
les hommes qui violent
people
sont des
who
malades.
actually
Non, les hommes qui
rape
violent et les hommes
or
qui
who
battent ne
abuse,
sont pas des malades.
are
Ils
sick
sont
people.
pas
They're
des
not sick.
ours ni des
They're
loups,
not bears
sont,
or wolves.
des hommes
They are
qui
men
ont été
who
éduqués dans une
were
certaine forme de
educated
masculinité.
in a
Je pense que
certain
cette
form of
masculinité, on doit
masculinity,
effectivement la questionner,
and we have to
non pas
question
pour accuser
this masculinity.
individuellement
Not
les
by,
hommes
we don't want to point
violents,
a finger
mais
at
pour
such and such a
questionner
man
justement
because
la
they're
structure
violent, but we
sociale
need
dans
to
laquelle
question the
cette
social
violence
structure
est
in which
mobilisée par ces
this
hommes.
violence
Et
is resorted to
de
by
la même
these very
manière,
men.
depuis qu'on
And
a
in
une
the same way,
cécité sur
since
ces violences-là,
we're
ou qu'on
totally
les
blind
considère
to
comme
this
tristement
abuse, or we
normales,
consider them as
en
sadly
tant que témoin,
normal,
on
as
sait pas non
witnesses,
plus comment
we
agir.
don't know
Donc,
how to
ça
act
veut dire que,
and what to do. What it
c'est un
means
programme
is
énorme,
that, this is a huge
mais
program
je
ahead of
crois qu'on
us,
est plusieurs
but I
à
think
l'avoir
there's,
entrepris,
there's several of
de
us working on this,
responsabiliser
so
la société
to
dans son
actually
ensemble par rapport à
make
ces
society
violences-là, et de
responsible to
questionner l'ensemble
account
de la société
for
par
this
rapport à
abuse,
ces
and all of
violences-là.
society has to
Et donc aussi
question
de donner des outils
itself on the abuse that is
à d'autres
perpetrated, and to give
individus,
tools to other
parce qu'on
individuals,
est entre
because,
du collectif et de
again,
l'individuel. Donc,
we're constantly switching from
donner des
collective to
outils,
individual,
dans les
and we have to
institutions,
have
dans les
the
écoles,
appropriate
dans
tools in
dans
the
le
different
système juridique,
associations,
doit
the legal
s'améliorer,
system, judicial
tous les
system,
mauvais, on
schools
va
that
pas
needs to
juste
improve,
de
and
côté, on
we're
va
not
essayer
just
de faire
going
qu'il
to,
soit mieux, etc.,
forget about the judicial system. We have to
notamment
do everything
dans
that's possible to
les
improve it, and let's not
Alors, je
forget
suis très
about the
heureuse d'apprendre qu'en
institutions.
en
I'm very happy to
organisation,
learn that in
agissent
the
de
Great
manière
Britain,
féministe.
institutions,
Moi, je suis
have
pas
a
tout à
very
fait
feminist
convaincue de la
outlook.
manière
I am
dont ça
not
se passe
convinced
ici.
of the
Je
way
pense
things
qu'il y a
are
encore
done
beaucoup de
here.
travail à faire
I think
pour
there's a
éviter
lot of work
justement
ahead
de
of
se
us
retrouver
to
dans une
avoid
situation de
ending up in a
vice-violence,
situation
où on
where you,
considère
sort of
que
tend to,
l'agresseur et l'agressé, finalement,
smooth
sont dans
and
une dynamique
out violence, that
et
the
que,
aggressor and the aggressed
finalement,
are in a sort of
c'est des
dynamic and
problèmes de
a sort of
couple, c'est
spiral, and
des
these
divers.
are,
Donc, non, il y a une-
typical
guerre,
couple
il y en a un qui
problems.
est
No, I
vice-versa,
think,
ça
there
peut
is
être
a whole, there's, people can become control freaks. So what's interesting, this, what you said about the individual and the collective, and I think, they both go hand in hand. That's what you just said. If we want to get society as a whole to change, we need to have individuals changing. So in my everyday work, I train professionals, health professionals or social workers, and I train them to actually detect acts of violence. We've talked a lot about silence, but in fact, for many, many people, they don't see acts of violence before being able to see, and not knowing what to do it, we are not able to detect abuse and violence in our surroundings, in our environment. I try to work with professionals, and I said, in your opinion, what is the best tool you have to detect acts of violence? And people say, eyes. You can look at marks or bruises, ears. You can listen. Yes, but you've noticed that difficult to hear, and that's perhaps not your best tool to detect acts of violence. Once you've detected, ears can prove useful, but before that, and so, little by little, your mouth. So what can you do with one's mouth? You can ask questions. You can ask the question to women in our environment, are you victims of violence? And in the room, then, professionals, look down at their shoes, they look at one another, they go, wow, this is hot stuff, asking the question outright. Can I try it with the people here? Can I try this? So, okay, stand up. This is what I do. Could you please stand up?
Allez-y, levez-vous. Alors, répétez après moi. Et salut.
Repeat after me. Hi.
Est-ce que tu as déjà été victime de
Have you
violence?
ever been a victim of violence?
C'est bon, vous pouvez vous rasseoir.
Sit down. That's fine.
Donc, techniquement, ça marche.
So,
On est d'accord.
technically
Votre bouche
speaking,
arrive
it
à
works.
prononcer ces mots-là.
You are
D'accord?
able to say
Sinon, il y a des
those words.
spécialistes de la bouche qui peuvent vous
Otherwise, I'm sure
Mais
some
pour
people
l'immense
can help
majorité
you,
des gens,
but
on arrive à prononcer ces mots-là.
usually we
fait,
are
pourquoi on
all
le fait pas?
able to do
Parce
it.
qu'on a peur.
Why don't we
On
do
a
it
peur de
then?
la
Because
réponse,
we are
en fait.
afraid.
On a peur
We are
que
afraid
on
of
nous
the
dise oui.
answer. We are
Et là, on
afraid
est
to
dans la
hear,
merde.
yes, I
Parce que
am.
c'est horrible, parce que c'est triste,
Because
parce que
it's
c'est
sad,
dur,
because
parce qu'on a
it's
déjà
hard
tellement de
to
problèmes
hear,
avec nous-mêmes
because
qu'on n'a
it's
pas envie de gérer les problèmes
so hard to manage one's
Et donc, moi,
life
ce que
that
je fais
someone
maintenant, c'est que j'ai ma
you
petite
don't want to
mallette.
manage
Parce qu'il y a des fois,
another
j'ai pas
one's
très envie de poser
problems.
la question non plus.
So
Moi
what
aussi,
I
j'ai des
do
problèmes, moi aussi,
myself,
je suis
because
fatiguée.
I too have
Et
my
donc,
own
je la pose
problems
quand
and
même,
I'm
mais j'ai ma
sometimes
petite mallette
tired,
de
but
réponse
I
pour Pôle
have
emploi.
a sort of a toolkit with questions and answers. I've got a list of phone numbers of support lines, a few sentences that you have to say in reply. First of all, I believe you. He's not allowed to do these things. It's against the law. These are the typical sentences you can tell a woman who is victim of violence. I believe you. It's not your fault. He's guilty, and it's against the law. So you ask a question, you give the phone number of an association, and you can give those 4 elements, and you can stop a lot of violence. So I agree. It's about changing society, changing education, laws, and so on and so on. But if each one of us, we do our own part to act against violence, how many of us are we tonight? 400, 500? Just imagine 500 people convincing 500 more. Within a few years' time, there won't be any more violence in Switzerland. Is that your program? 2 or 3 years? Yeah, that's what we're trying to do with an association that I work with. If we're trying to recruit 100,000 people into this movement, people who will go and ask this question, give phone numbers and give those answers. If we do that every day, within a few years' time, there won't be any more violence. Yes, I want to talk about another association, another group called AVEC, which works in support of women subjected to violence. So if you ever need to talk to somebody, do get in touch with them.
Mariah, what has the hashtag #MeToo changed? We saw you recently at the Golden Globes with Emma Watson. Come up, take the mic, speak up. Again, we're in this whole era of speaking up with hope that something will change.
So it's a very complicated thing. I want to go back to something that Atia said, which is the thing about believing women and all those people around who didn't do anything. And I think there's something around which voices we hear, who we see, and whether we believe particular groups of women. And so one of the things that I know sometimes, you know, there's an organization at home that sometimes does theater workshops where they focus on if a woman has been drinking, so if a woman appears to be drunk and in the street and she's been assaulted, will we intervene? And very often we don't intervene because there's a way sometimes that she's, you know, it's almost like she deserves this, right? Or if it happens to be a woman of color, then we also don't intervene. So there's something around sometimes the value that we place on some lives versus the value that we place on other lives in terms of how we intervene. And I need to say that because I can't ignore the fact that actually there are probably some people that turned away from you because of who you are and who Steve was and who Steve is. And I think that that's really important, and that connects to the hashtag #MeToo. So Tarana Burke is a black woman. She's a woman of color. She started the Me Too work in New York 10 years ago. And what's happened is a group of women in Hollywood then started saying Me Too. And what we've seen is this amazing amplification, which says a couple of things about our society. One is that we're really messed up and we need it to be celebrities that speak out before we can actually hear, right? That's a problem. But that's the world that we live in. So given the world that we live in, it's really important that we have that amplification. So having people like Emma Watson and other women in Hollywood speak out has been critical because it creates a space of solidarity between activists and between women in the entertainment industry. And basically what we're saying is that your privilege doesn't inoculate you from violence. Like, those are women who we see as some of the most powerful women in the world. Those are women that are resourced. Those are women that have access, and they weren't protected. So what does that mean for every woman on this planet? It means that actually anywhere that you live and anywhere that you work, you can still be targeted by men in terms of everything from harassment to rape to domestic violence. That's important for us to understand. I think we're in a particular moment in time. This is not a new movement. We've been doing this for years, and we're going to keep doing it. But we are at a moment in time where we're seeing this unique solidarity that I think we need to make sure that we harness to have those really difficult conversations. That's the importance of this particular moment.
I'd like to mention that with your movie, A Better Man, there's a site, there's a blog, and on that blog, you do give tools for people to take action.
Absolutely. If you go to our website, abettermanfilm.com, we have created, our team has created some materials, some discussion kits. So if you leave here today and you feel like you still need to unpack this more, either by yourself or with a group of people, you can access this discussion kit on our website. We also have a specific discussion kit for men who see this film together so that they can unpack the film. We have an incredible Start the Conversation. So start the conversation with a friend who's experiencing violence. Start the conversation if you know somebody who is using violence. And we have lots of information on intervention and what you can do to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you. Un mot avant qu'on passe.
Another word before we give the floor to people in the audience. Caroline Deas, people often describe you as a new feminist. What does it mean today, being a new feminist? A couple of years ago, I was called by a journalist. She wanted me to talk in the media about feminism. She wanted to know some new feminists. And I said, well, I can answer. And she said, no, I want younger people. I was 35 at the time, and so I thought it was kind of funny. So you're always old for somebody. I don't believe in labels like new feminism. I mean, this has been going on for such a long time, women's liberation.
Les choses changent, hein. Je suis pas du tout complètement déprimée.
Olympe de Gouges, things are changing. Of course, I'm not saying we're exactly in the same place that we were decades ago, but the deep reasons and the obstacles essentially remain the same. Even though we're not fighting exactly the same thing as we did when we were fighting for the right to vote, for example, but the image, the project that we have for society as a whole is basically the same. If we want feminism to change, we need a change in society. Once we get true equality in society, well, there won't be any more feminists. I think this is not really exactly for tomorrow. I've got a son who's 7 years old, and the other day he was asking, what will you do when we have equality? What will be your job? I just evaded the question, not to tell him that I don't think there will be equality tomorrow, really. I'd like to give the floor to the audience. If you raise your hand, we can hand you a mic. And then you can ask a question to Colline, to Atia, to Maria.
Voilà, je vois des mains qui se lèvent, juste là. Dans la rangée du milieu.
Yes, good evening. First of all, I'd like to give you one element before asking my question. I don't know whether you know about it, Madame Deas. In this terrible case of the 11-year-old rape wasn't retained as a claim, but as a charge. But the person will be now charged for rape, although rape wasn't retained initially. My question is now, Atia, we saw that you have now been able to build a family, have a stable life, but I'd like to know, what about Steve? Did he have other relationships afterwards? Did he use violence against other women? Has he got a stable life now? But because I think he too was trying to heal as well.
He definitely was wanted to heal. And he did heal through the process of making the film. We had an agreement before we started filming that if he was going to participate, we would not discuss his private life, his family life, and which I agreed to because this could have been many different types of film. And I really wanted to focus on him and I and our relationship. I also didn't want to bring the possibility, although I don't know about his history with other women, I didn't want to bring them in because that's their story to tell, and ethically I felt like it was not okay for me to bring up other women that he may have been with and may have hurt. And, you know, it's been 20 years and he has a family and, you know, I saw him, what I can tell you is I saw him last week and he's doing okay. This is very, you know, he has a noticeable face, and in Toronto where we live, there's been lots written about this film. So he's had to deal with people knowing about what he's done to me in his workplace and, you know, where he lives and his friends and actually some of his family. And so that's been really difficult for him. But he's at a point where he 100% believes that this was the right thing to do. He has no regrets about making this film, but it still means that it's really hard. We don't see people who have harmed others talking out in public, right? So we didn't, for us, it was an experiment to see actually how other people would respond to him. And you know, within an audience, there's many different responses to Steve, right? Like some people are still very angry, some don't believe him, some think it's amazing, some people think he's really brave, and I think it's a little bit of all those things, which is.
And how do you feel about him now, today, after this movie?
Oh.
Have you forgiven him, or is it about forgiveness?
It's not about forgiveness. No, it's definitely, this film is not about forgiveness. It's about having the person who hurt me be accountable and take responsibility. That's very different than forgiveness. There's something about forgiveness in these situations that does not feel right to me. And I think, again, it's because it's something that I would have to do. And I think the forgiveness might come to, he needs to forgive himself for what he did. And I believe, and I actually would like him to do that only because he has taken responsibility and he's being accountable and he is committed to ending his use of violence. And something else I can tell you about Steve is, you know, he is now in therapy. So that's continued, not with Todd, but with someone else. And so am I, actually, because I hadn't been in therapy. I was a therapist and a counselor. And sometimes we're the worst ones to be getting help and care for ourselves. But both of us have now seen our own therapists. And I plan on seeing him while the film is out here. I would like to see him every maybe 6 months to just check in, because it feels very strange to me to be constantly talking about him and not seeing him, and both of us having a chance to see how we're doing. Plus, you know, I still have more questions for him that I wasn't able to ask during the process of making this film. It was 3 years in terms of the footage with Steve and I, and something that I regret that's not in the film is a timeline. Steve and I only met with Todd Augustus Scott, the facilitator, 3 times in 2.5 years. So this is really the beginning of a process. Because I'm not with Steve anymore, and it's very different. I ended it here because it was sufficient for me. It was enough. I was like, I got way more, like I said, I got more than I expected. I never thought that I would heal through this process. That's a surprise to me. I wanted to sit down with him. I wanted to ask him some questions, and I thought it could be used as a tool for educational purposes, but I didn't know what that would look like. So for me to go through the process and slowly start to heal, and what I mean by heal, it's very significant. I was having nightmares for decades, terrifying nightmares of Steve or someone else attacking me, coming after me. By the time I sat down with him the second time, the nightmares stopped. I have not had one since. It's been almost 3 years. Yeah, my panic attacks have decreased hugely. So in a situation like this, I would be having major panic attacks, and I'm not. And I get them once in a while, but that's decreased. So, you know, I have a chronic insomnia, but what I can say is now when I'm sleeping, my sleeps are deeper. I don't walk out the door and I'm not afraid. I used to walk outside and I was on guard and I constantly thought that someone was gonna hurt me. It's a terrible space to be in. I was always looking over my back, looking over my shoulder, walking into a space, trying to figure out where are all the exits. If something's gonna happen, because I always thought that something bad was gonna happen, which is catastrophic thinking. So all those things have either decreased or disappeared. And I'm just shocked, because I would never have guessed that for me, I'm healing because I'm talking to the person who hurt me. It's just, it blows me away. And so I want to share this because I think if for some people, this is not for everybody, but it could be for some people, and we should have this available for people who want to do this. And since this film has been released, I've had people privately coming up to me or emailing me and telling me that they've actually met with the people that have hurt them. They've done the same thing in the past, not like this formal, but they have met up with them, and they don't tell anybody because they feel like everyone else will judge them for doing this, that they're putting themselves in an unsafe situation. And that's not true. It could be helpful for them. There comes a point when you're always afraid that they might come after you. Why can't we sit down with that person if there's the possibility that we can feel safe again? And that's what this film has done with me, and that's what I want this message to get out there, that we need to start talking to people who have been harmed more, and what we need to be asking them is, what is it that you want? What do you need, and how can we do that?
Clear enough. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Are there any other questions? Anybody else who would like to actually ask a question? Yes, we have someone in the front rows here. This is also a question for you, Atia. So in the film, there's a time when you said that was the first time that you were in love, and that you weren't questioning your love story because you felt that this is how it happens in every couple's life. And you had no other references, and you didn't know about how things happened, in other couples, like your parents, for instance. I mean, couldn't you relate, to another couple's lives?
I wish I had. No, I had in my home growing up, I did not see this type of violence. However, I grew up in a family where we didn't talk about relationships. We didn't talk about healthy relationships. We didn't talk about unhealthy relationships. We did not talk. And I was 16, and we pretty much moved in together right away, and the violence started right away. And so, I do get asked, like, why didn't you just go back home? And that was not an option. It was not somewhere where I felt like I would get the support that I needed. Which is sad, but it does come back to we do need to be talking to our kids, and our kids need to know what relationships can look like, healthy relationships and unhealthy. It's really, really important. And I think, my son's 11 and he clearly knows what domestic violence is. But as he gets older, I'm going to give him more and more information about what that looks like. And how he can help his friends, women or men who may find themselves in these situations. It's really hard to talk about it. I find it, I can talk about it to anybody, but when it's my son, I'm terrible at it, which is why I think, we need this in schools. Something that I'm really excited about is the film is going to be used in our province of Ontario. Right now, it's being tested with 8 educators and social workers in schools, and we have a guide that goes along with it, and they're testing it right now. And so some students are seeing it, and we're going to revise it based on the feedback from the teenagers, and then it'll be offered next year as an option for teachers to use to teach teenagers about teen dating violence and domestic violence. So that's exciting. But that's happening in grade 12, and I do believe that we should be having these conversations with our children much younger. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I just agree.
Okay.
I just completely agree.
Me too. Yeah, there's because actually, in policy terms, it's a thing that's called primary prevention. The work that you do that's changing social norms and changing our broader culture. And if we don't do this work in schools, if we don't do this work across society, if we don't change our media messaging, if we don't handle all of those things, what we're doing is we're leaving our children to actually be educated in ways that are reinforcing these harmful, the thing you said about masculinity, like we're teaching boys toxic masculinity, and we're teaching girls that actually you're the window dressing and you're the thing that is there to be victimized, etc. And we do have to change it. This is our responsibility. Like, we need to be able to say, I'm liking ending violence against women and girls in 2 or 3 years. It might be a little bit longer, maybe, but I want to know. I have a grandson now, and I want to know that he's coming into a world that we're dealing with this and that we're changing it, rather than always having to be looking at what we do to support victims and survivors. We need to stop having to clean up. We need to prevent this from happening in the first place.
Mariah, you work equally with the United Nations today. Is that being taken further into structures?
I hope so. I think a lot of the team at UN Women are really committed to making sure that this happens, but the UN is a huge institution. And one of the things I said at a UN event last week is the UN needs to put its own house in order, right? That, like we're hearing stories all the time of peacekeepers harming women. We're hearing, we know stories of harassment that's occurring within the UN system, So the UN itself, while you've got broad ambitions, is not yet completely a safe space for women and girls. And so we need to make sure that that space is also addressing the violence within that space. But I know that UN Women has a whole mandate around violence against women and girls, and prevention is a critical part of that. And I'm really supportive of them making sure that prevention is held at the forefront of the work. There's some good women in UN Women doing amazing work around primary prevention.
Par rapport, j'ai envie de...
I feel like telling a story that happened to me. Yes, I have a son who's 6.5 years old, and when he was 4 years old, more or less, he wanted to buy the same pair of shoes as me. It was tennis shoes, a sort of a pink orangey color, flashy pink. And he used to go to school with those tennis shoes, and he was very sad because he said the other kids made fun of him because he had pink shoes. And I went to see the school teacher, said, "Oh yes, it's true." When I saw the shoes, I thought, I hope there's not going to be a problem. So give it to the shoes were the problem for her. And I went to see the headmaster, and I gave a whole list of solutions, because I was working on equality and I had some resources, and I got other people to help me out in Geneva, and I connected him with lots of other, and he gave me an answer, and he said that if there was a problem, my son could also always go and see the school nurse, so totally unsatisfactory. And the answer was obviously, when I said, what can we do? Not much. And I went to actually get a book out of the library, because I know the resources available in this library, and there's books on equality with a book sort of the little boy who likes pink, and they read this in classroom, and the problem basically came to a standstill. But I had to come up with the resources, and I had to actually have the will to do something about it. And so I'm mentioning this today because we're in Geneva, this is 2018, and our school system is not ready to face up to masculinity. Pink shoes, the way we bring up our children, the way we actually throw stigma upon them, and the way we decide to protect them against these stigmas. So in Geneva, when we're talking about starting to work with children earlier on, it doesn't mean that we're going to do a workshop with them when they're 16 years old, on the divine order. That's fine, but that's not enough. So we have to set up when you need to have available resources for the teachers from the youngest age, and this is fundamental.
Absolutely.
So we need available resources for the teachers, but we also need teachers that are being held to account around their behaviors. Like, sometimes young women talk about the harm that they experience within the school system, and that teachers aren't always safe people. And so there's also something about making sure that teachers are trained, but that the education system is robust enough so that we have safe environments. We basically need to have schools accountable, or places of worship accountable, or parliament accountable. We need transformation at every possible level.
D'autres questions?
Any other questions? Yes. So I see several people. Yes. There's someone on the right who's had their hand raised for quite some time now. And then here. We only have one mic roving around. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for the forum and the film. So in this room, about half of the women who are here who've actually been victims of abuse, and I wish that each and every one of them has the courage to talk about what happened to them, and the others who haven't been victims of abuse to ask the question, if you know someone who has been victims of abuse, and amongst those, amongst aggressors, you have women who are mothers, sisters, daughters, and this is something we tend to forget, and this seems to be fundamental. Thank you. And abuse can be physical, verbal, or racist. And all the different forms of violence. I see several hands raised. Yes, right in the middle there. People have been waiting to get the mic.
Voilà, vous êtes plusieurs, donc passez-vous le micro après.
Okay, just pass the mic around.
First of all, I would like to thank you, and I think you have so much courage to stand up and to make such a movie, and it's a wonderful thing to do that for us women, any women. It doesn't need to be a woman that has been abused sexually and how you have gone through it, but I think it's just a wonderful step. And I think I have so much admiration for you to have so much positive energy coming from such a traumatizing event. And first of all, I would like to thank you for doing such an amazing thing. Then I would just like to talk about a few topics that have marked me in the movie. First of all, the fact that the teachers didn't help you, which I find just scandalous. The fact that for so long you felt like you didn't have a voice, that you had to fight for your right to be seen as a victim or as a survivor, and it just shows the gap between men and women in our society and the constant inequalities that we as young women face. And it doesn't have to be that we are sexually harassed or violated or anything, but it's really the fact that we as women always have to fight for a right to stand up. We have to say no. I mean, so many times we are asked 10 times the same question. Yeah, don't you want to have something with me? Don't you want to have sex with me? And you have to say 10 times, as if one time it's not enough. And I think that that's just something really important to take out from that movie, is that even though it happens on a different scale, this affects most women, and that's an important thing also for men to finally acknowledge that, we always have to fight for that. And it's just difficult for people who aren't women to actually understand that. So, well, thank you so much for making such a beautiful movie and to fight for women's rights. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I think something I take from that is it's true. It's like we are the survivors or victims, and then we're the ones who work in the field when we're trying to prevent violence, and the questions are always asked to us, and we're asked why we stayed or why we didn't fight back, and why can't you remember what happened when you were being raped? You don't know the color of the comforter. We're asked all these really harmful questions, and yet all the weight has been on us. And that's really another reason why I was like, it's time that we hear from the people who are using violence. We need to figure out what's going on with them. I didn't do anything. I am not to blame. And I don't believe that people actually believe that yet. And there's a lot of victim blaming, and victim blaming happens from people, like, it's shocking sometimes who I hear it come from. So this is something, it's so ingrained, I think, in our society to question women, to not believe them. And that definitely needs to change. And so we do need more men talking about this. This is like huge. And today I'm so happy to see so many men here. I've had many audiences that have been mostly women. And on social media, on our our film page, it's mostly women. And yet what the film was about is about being accountable and taking responsibility. So it's just like, we have a long way to go. However, we do have a lot, I've had a lot of men approaching me just who are really nervous. They're just unsure of how to proceed, which I think is interesting. But in a way, I'm like, just jump in, just start, just let you guys, and start together, get together, and figure it out. There's lots been written. We've been writing about this for decades, for hundreds of years maybe, right? So it's there, go do the work, and support us and prevent it. You can prevent it from happening.
Et juste peut-être rajouter quelque
So just like to add something to this, to the attention of the men who are in this room. So I have a tendency of saying, I'm a woman, but I'm white. I've and I'm heterosexual. I have a lot of privileges. And as you've just said, men, you must speak out. For people who have had been less privileged than myself, and we all have to do this. And in terms of the responsibility, as people who've perhaps received more at birth, or we have even perhaps more of a responsibility to speak out and to assist those people who are fighting. And what I'm saying is that it's not just the men and women. Women also bear responsibility, and white women vis-a-vis other women who are not white, who are also enduring other types of abuse. And it's not just men. Women also are responsible and must act. Yes, if you'll allow me, there's the comment. It was in English. I'm not sure I got it all, but I have the feeling that what you were saying is that it's not necessary to have been victim of a rape to understand what women are up against. And what's interesting in the example, you said we have to say 10 times no when someone wants to actually go to bed with you. This is called sexual harassment in France. This is interesting because you don't need to have been a victim to have actually experienced this. So in fact, what you've experienced is sexual harassment. This is punished with 10 years imprisonment. So we have a tendency of minimizing and of not actually putting words to acts. Someone who's actually says something that has a sexual connotation and does it over and over again when you haven't said, "Oh yeah, great, let's go." But this is actually called sexual harassment. On the first time, in a quarter of a second, when you make a sexual proposal to someone and the other person doesn't want to sleep with you, you understand that immediately. You know that there's no way. And we call this, I don't know, someone in Geneva, it means, oh my God, for the guy, he gets, sort of, he knows he can't get there. That's why sexual harassment is on the second question. I can try and actually flirt with my neighbor, and if tomorrow, we have another panel and I start again, I've understood that there's no way. My objective is to make her feel uncomfortable, and this is called sexual harassment. And there's a second thing that's interesting in what you said, and we find it difficult to express it, and what we call the continuum of violence. See, I am convinced that if there was no more sexist remarks here, there would be no sexist insults, and then there would be no sexual harassment. If you have no more sexual harassment, you would not have sexual abuse, and if you didn't have sexual abuse, there would be no rape. And when we start sexist remarks, it's sort of an escalation, then everything falls like a house of cards. And so it doesn't mean that rape equals a sexual comment, but obviously, but there's sort of continuum, an escalation from bottom to top, and this is all, in fact, sexually related violence. There's another question in the room, and then over there. Yes, it was it. Thank you. My question is for Colleen and Caroline, on the topic of how we can improve the judicial system and improving public life. You were very clear about what you said, Caroline. You said we have to say, "I believe you," and that we need to say, you are not the guilty one when you're in front of a woman who's been a victim of sexual abuse. But in our society today, prove it. oh, careful, there's a statute of limitations, and there's all sorts of things. Oh, you forget it, you're going to fail, and there's no point. So what I want to know is, as regards political responsibility, I mean, there are several cases at hand in France today. What's your position when, there's a limitation period, and you've gone beyond the limitation? You say, okay, forget about it, do you have another opinion? My other question is, should ministers resign when there's rumors hovering around? And my third question is, how do you feel about, or what do you think? Oh, I forgot it. I forgot the last question. Okay.
Il y a beaucoup de questions dans votre question. Je voudrais juste réagir sur une expression que vous avez employée, qui est l'expression bruit qui court. Parce que pour moi, cette expression-là, comme l'expression la rumeur, en fait, c'est un des plus gros problèmes auxquels on doit faire face. C'est-à-dire qu'au lieu de considérer les témoignages des femmes comme des informations à traiter, on les considère comme des rumeurs et des bruits qui courent. Dans la quasi-totalité des cas, une femme qui raconte une violence qu'elle a subie, c'est une violence qui est réelle, qui a existé. Moi, j'appelle ça un témoignage. Et ce que je dis souvent aux personnes qui me disent « Ah, attention aux rumeurs, attention au risque de délation, attention... » Ça ne marche pas la traduction? Non, okay. Attention au risque de délation.
Yes, when people tell me you should beware of rumors, but I tell those people, what would you do? Every day I get testimony from political leaders, from people who are very well known, who appear on TV. What would you do in my shoes? Would you consider it like a rumor with no foundation at all? At what point are you going to stop considering the testimony from women who were victims like rumors? When are you going to start considering those seriously? For me, what matters for me is that when you were talking about ministers, they seem to be treated differently. Some of them had to resign before they were actually charged with anything. Some of them considered that it was serious enough and had to resign. But in a case of rape, instead of another kind of issue, this was not considered serious enough to justify a resignation. And that's my point. I wonder why is rape not considered as serious? Now, about the statute of limitations. I am personally convinced that justice is in the hands of men, basically. I say it and I truly believe it. I'm not convinced by the justice system because the aim of the legal system is to establish the responsibility of the perpetrator. But we, as feminists, what matters for us is to recognize the status of victims. Sometimes the perpetrator is acquitted at the end, in spite of there being some kind of evidence, but at no point we tell the victim that we are not fully able to completely prove the guilt, but we know that you have obviously been a victim. That's not the purpose of justice, and hence for me, I don't consider it as a valid tool. I personally believe that any type of sexual violence should not be submitted to a statute of limitations. I don't believe that this is not the
qui va aider grand chose. Et surtout, je suis très
I don't believe justice is the solution in any case. And I'm very angry that to hear some people say that women should turn to justice. It's a very easy way to turn you to a solution where we just give up.
Plus des potentielles délations qu'il y aurait que des cas avérés de violences sexuelles qui sévissent depuis des centaines de milliers d'années. Et du coup, ça veut dire qu'en gros, on fait
Basically, people pay more attention to potential victims from
Une question ici, voilà.
denouncement, men who might be victims from denouncement by women.
Adia, thank you so much for your film. I lived in Toronto for many years. I'm a fellow Canadian, so it was very good to see your film here in Geneva. I am so interested to hear you talk about how this film is going to make its way into schools and into curriculum. I can see so much potential for that, with especially the senior high school level age group you're talking about, and the ways in which students like yourself, who are, for reasons that have to do with gender and race and class and so on, invisible in the struggles they're going through in schools. But I want to go back to your film for just one brief moment and say that there's also a scene in the film that I'm struggling to think through in relation to that idea of taking the film forward into discussion with young people. And it's the scene where you go to Sterling Road and to the apartment, and you say you want to go back under conditions of safety and revisit that site. And then you start to feel sick. And you have a physical reaction to the situation. And that, to me, that spoke very powerfully to me of the unsafety of the situation on some level, or at least the idea that it's a situation like that could be potentially re-traumatizing or even physically dangerous. Although it happened in your film under, structured conditions, and you've been clear about that.
Yes.
But I'm struggling with this idea that we've been talking about the film as a healing journey and so on, that because of sexism and structures of power, even within our healing journeys, there's the potential for more harm.
Absolutely.
And so I wonder how to get at that nuance in the ways in which the healing journey is talked about and understood, especially with young people.
Yes.
I can imagine one reading would be, let's all go talk to our exes. And so
yes, no,
you said
definitely
that's not for everyone, but I think more is needed.
Yeah, and in our discussion guides, we definitely go through that, and that will, when we are, when this is presented to high school students, it's actually not just like, here's the film, and that's it. It's actually, there's like a week-long curriculum that goes with it, and there's about 3 days of work before they even see the film, and then the film's seen, and then there's 2 days afterwards to kind of unpack it all. But in terms of me, when I almost threw up in front of the house, that was a definite strong reaction. It happened quickly, and as soon as it was, the one thing is, like, during that whole time, it wasn't that I didn't feel safe. It was it was just so emotionally beyond what I've ever felt. Like, I describe it like if you're watching a cartoon character and they just explode, like, that's what it felt like was gonna happen to me. And I think it was everything. It was having the crew there. It was just being back on that street. I had gone back to those homes before by myself. And had similar reactions. So I think a lot of it had to do of just going back to those places. However, I really wanted to go with Steve. And I wanted to go with Steve because I was in a place of power and healing. And I wanted to, and this is in the film a little bit, but I knew that there'd be power in replacing the memories of violence with him being beside me and me being safe. And I did feel safe. And you can get triggered by anything, as we know, right? So and it's so different for so many people. And in that case, I actually did feel totally in control. It was just, it's almost like intellectually, I was like up here in terms of how I was dealing with Steve, but my body was still down here, and it had to like catch up. And that's how I see that. So I actually, even when it was happening, it didn't feel traumatic to me, which might be hard to understand. It felt like a release in a good way. Yeah, but definitely I see what and I tried in the film to make it as clear as possible that this is my journey, this is my story, I chose to do it, I invited him into this conversation, and that other people, I'm not saying to everyone that they should do this. I was really hoping to make that clear, but we do reinforce that when we're working with teenagers. Yeah, and thank you. Thanks for your concern, it's very valid.
Une dernière question.
One very last question. I saw somebody over there.
Je sais pas où est le micro. Là.
First of all, I really want to thank you for this evening and this discussion, and congratulations, you are being very brave. I wanted to come back after your intervention. You were talking about harassment in Switzerland. It's not considered as harassment yet in Switzerland, legally speaking, but I do consider it as harassment. I think there's a lot that we should do in schools for people to become aware, for boys and men to become aware that this is not normal. But there are so many things to do to work with young people. Don't you realize that you are actually harassing me when you ask me the question a first time and then a second time and coming back on it again and again? In the film, I must say that I felt a lot of empathy between the two of you when you are talking together. And I think there's a lot that we can take from it in schools, because you're beginning to understand how he worked, and he understand how you felt and what you went through. And I find it very strong, very powerful. I think about what we could do in schools. I think I felt the empathy between the two of you, and I think that is missing. Maybe young kids, when they're very young, they are able to feel a lot more empathy, but it fades away when you grow up. And when you feel empathy, when you understand the other one, it goes a long way.
Yes, and I mean, that was something that I really wanted to portray in the film. I wanted it to be a very respectful conversation. And some people have told me that they think that I'm too respectful and that I should be a little more harsh. And I actually firmly disagree with that. I think what I wanted to show and what I wanted to experience with Steve is a way of communicating that we had never communicated in the past. I wanted to treat him with respect. I wanted him to respect me for the first time, you know. And so I didn't want to go down to a level and treat him in a disrespectful way, because I didn't want to resort to what he had done to me. And I do think the more honest we were, the more vulnerable. We were both incredibly vulnerable. And when you become vulnerable, that's when you find the truths. You know, that's when the truths of your stories come out. And I think something in terms of masculinity and toxic masculinity and what goes along with that is this whole idea of asking for help. When I have so many women friends who go to therapy, and I have so many friends that are men that don't, and it's this whole idea of asking for help, and that's seen as vulnerable. And I think we really need to change that view on therapy. And that's also gonna take a long time. So I think that what we can do to support other people, again, is talk about therapy openly and how it's affecting us. For some of us, it doesn't help everyone, but for many of us, it does. And I think that's something that we need to raise more awareness. Yeah.
All right.
And so just a couple of things. I think for each woman, it's going to be the thing that works for her. For some women, they might have needed to shout at him, and they might have needed to express rage in a particular way. And I think there's also space for that, because there is something around also, you know, the thing that you said about demonstrating the respect. some women are not going to want to be at that place of actually, I'm going to be respectful to the person that harmed me. For some women, it might be actually what I want to do is really scream at you. And I think when we hear women react that way, it's really important for us to not silence them. Because actually, women resist and heal in a whole range of ways. And this is the way that you chose, and I support that. And if a woman is having a shouting match, and that's the thing that happens for her, then I'm also going to support her in that, because it's actually about her autonomy, her healing, her resistance. And we need to be able to hold on to that, so that this isn't a single narrative. There is no journey of a single perpetrator and a single survivor. It really, although we have commonalities, i.e. power, control, masculinity, inequality, each person's experience is quite specific, and it's really important that we honor that. I want to say something around the thing around harassment. I really wanted to pick up on, it was your, and there's a way that we're still framing things as women having to be in the position of saying no. And I want us to rethink what is happening there. There's always this idea, and this is a very heteronormative model, by the way, so just to say that. And it also comes at it from the man as the pursuer and as a woman as the vessel. And so what she is supposed to do is say no. How about we have a conversation that looks like, this involves an enthusiastic yes. So what is happening is this is not you putting me under pressure and me having to say no, but we are negotiating what is going to happen between us. Because especially, like, I'm British, right? So we are really very, very polite, we think at least. And what happens is you say to somebody, like, no is not actually a routine part of the way that we communicate, like seriously. So so there's all of this pressure for this woman to be in this situation where she's having to go, no. How about we teach our sons not to rape? How about we teach our sons not to sexually harass? How about we have a conversation that looks like, this is actually much more about, is she engaging with you and is she saying that she's interested, rather than she's sitting there waiting on you to make a move on her that she then has to say no or yes. No, let's just reframe it. Let's reshape this entire thing. Can we not have men that feel it's their job to pursue women? And can we not have a situation where women have to defend our bodies against men? It's upside down. It really is quite crazy. This is crazy. If this was any other context, we'd be saying this is insane, and we accept this as the norm.
Thank you, Mara. Très joli mot de face que quelqu'un aimerait compléter. Caroline.
Peut-être, ce qu'on a quand même pas mal parlé des politiques publiques, il y a eu plusieurs interpellations sur qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire. On a beaucoup parlé de l'école. C'est pas le seul levier. Et moi, je trouve intéressant de s'inspirer d'autres politiques publiques qui ont marché. Et en France, on en a une qui a bien marché, c'est celle sur la sécurité routière. C'est pas gagné, il y a encore trop de morts sur les routes.
For example, in France, we've had a very interesting campaign on road safety. We've been able to reduce the number of deaths on the roads, so it works. There have been public policies that have been working. 20 or 30 years ago, in a family lunch, when your uncle was completely drunk at the end of the lunch and wanted to take his car, and nobody would react. They would, on the contrary, offer a last drink before he would hit the road. I'm not saying the issue is completely solved to death, but usually, I think more often than not, people would ask, no, maybe you should wait a little, why don't you sleep at home, or why don't we call you a taxi? So we've been able to change behaviors, change states of minds. And the same worked for cigarettes, for tobacco. For example, if you tried to start smoking in a restaurant today, people would be looking at you, are you crazy or what? So things have changed, our behaviors have changed, so we know how to do it. There are five basic steps. First of all, you have to make it a political priority. For example, having the president go on TV several times a year and telling people rape is not allowed, stop being violent. lot.
appliquer les sanctions.
Second
Il ne
step,
suffit pas que la loi soit bien
sanctions.
écrite. En France, on a plutôt une loi protectrice
In
du point de
France,
vue
for
des violences,
example,
mais elle n'est
the
pas
law
appliquée.
is quite
Donc, il faut faire
protective,
appliquer
but
les
it's
sanctions
not
de manière
properly
exemplaire,
applied.
montrer
So we
l'exemple.
need to be
Troisième chose, il
exemplary
faut
and
former les
apply
professionnels
sanctions. The
pour
third
justement appliquer
step
les sanctions
is
et en
to
recruter de
train
nouveaux. C'est ce qu'on a
professional
fait sur la
people.
sécurité routière. On a
That's what
formé
we
les
did for
policiers et les
road
gendarmes, mais on a
safety. We
recruté de nouveaux
trained
pour faire appliquer les lois.
police
Si on formait
officers.
tous les médecins,
If
tous
we
les
trained
magistrats,
all
tous les travailleurs
doctors,
sociaux, toutes les
all
travailleuses
social
sociales,
workers,
à en
all
finir avec les
teachers
violences. Moi,
to
je
put
pense
an
qu'en
end to
3 ans,
violence,
on
I
peut
truly believe that
largement
within the
atteindre
space of 2 or 3
la
years, we
réussite
could
de la
make
sécurité
it.
routière. La quatrième chose,
The
c'est que sur la
fourth
sécurité
step
routière,
is, as we
tous
did for
les
road
enfants
safety,
de France, de
all
Navarre, tous
children,
ont été
all
formés de manière
children
obligatoire dans les
in
écoles à
France
apprendre le code de la
were
route. Moi,
trained
en cinquième,
to
évidemment, il
learn
n'était pas question que je
the
conduise, mais je connaissais le code de la route. C'est obligatoire. Tout le monde a eu cette expérience
the
sociale en même
rules
temps.
of
Et ça crée
behavior
quelque chose
when
dans la
you're on the
société. Il
road.
faut créer un brevet de
So
la
we need
non-violence
to do exactly the
obligatoire pour
same,
tous les enfants.
create some
la
kind of
cinquième chose, c'est la
degree,
campagne de
some kind of
communication.
training
En
for
France, on a mis 12 millions
for
d'euros
that,
par an de
for
communication pour
for
accompagner
kids
ce
at
changement de
school.
mentalité sur la
And the
sécurité
last
routière.
step is
Ça fait
funding.
10 ans qu'on met environ 500
We
000 euros par an
spent
sur les violences. Donc,
millions on
voilà. Donc,
road
si on fait ces
safety
5
in
choses-là
France,
de
and if we
même
did the
ampleur
same
sur les violences dans tous les
for
pays du
violence
monde,
against women, we
peut-être
would
pas
get
3
the
ans,
same
d'accord.
results. Maybe not
Mais
in
en
the space
10
of
ans,
3 years,
on
okay,
divise
I
par 4
agree.
le nombre de
But at
viols
least
dans le
in
monde. Moi,
10
je
years,
signe.
in
Alors,
the
ça
space
fait
of
toujours
10
trop.
months, we would
Mais
be
franchement, je
reducing
signe quand même en bas du papier.
halving the number of rapes.
Last words, Atiya, before we conclude this evening, besides the fact that really we're so grateful you were here with this movie and for your openness and honesty, really.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'd like to thank you all for being here. And I think to the festival and the festival organizers, you know, it means the world to me because you chose this film. You didn't have to choose it. And that's really important because we need to be having these conversations in spaces like this, face to face, because that's where change is really going to happen, and we're able to ask questions that are uncomfortable, and we may not all agree, and we need to have conversations about it. So I really want to thank the festival organizers for all the work, because it's a lot of work to put us here all together on this stage. And thank you for coming to see the film and for listening to my story. That's why I made the film. And so this is really exciting to be so far from where I made it. So I really appreciate you all being a part of this. Thank you.
Merci, Atiya.
Thank you, Atiya.
Merci à vous tous.
Well,
Merci d'avoir été là.
I'd like to thank you all. Thank you
au
for
FIFDH
coming this
d'avoir
evening. Thank
organisé
you
cette
to
soirée.
the
Merci
FIFDH
également
for
aux
having
deux
organized this evening, and I'd
traductrices
like to thank also the
qui n'ont
two
pas arrêté
interpreters
tout au cours de
who
la
didn't
soirée
stop
de
all evening
passer
long
de
to
l'anglais au
actually
français
switch from
et
English to French and
vice-versa.
French to English, and vice
Merci à
versa.
tous. Au revoir.
Thank you all.